Shipshape.vc is a free-to-use investor search engine. We are aggregating data from the web. We're making that data free for founders to search through. And we really focus in on the types of investors that founders might want to be going to search for and basically speak with regards to their upcoming rounds. So who is it that they should be focusing their time on with building relationships? It's a real problem. It's one that we identified very early on, actually in a previous business. So my co-founder and I were working there, and we were trying to find investors that were relevant for a really niche domain. And it was a real struggle. There weren't very good resources out there that were useful to founders. And they also used to cost an absolute fortune, still do. Just think about it in terms of points of alignment. So where do your interests align? Are you a startup that's developing something that's going to be of interest to that fund? Are you raising a check size that's going to be relevant to that fund's essentially mathematical model and the way that they've worked out that they need to deploy capital to achieve like the right balance between diversification in terms of the number of bets that they're making and their ability to provide follow-on funding? So if you're raising the wrong amount, then that's an element where you're not necessarily going to have fit. If you're in the wrong sector, you wouldn't have fit there. But actually, if these are characteristics that are in line with what a VC is looking for and an investor is looking for, then ultimately you're in a much better place to not only start that conversation, but for that conversation to conclude well, and then for all of the years that you hopefully have working together ahead. I think you really hit the nail on the head with the focus on the values piece. I think that's probably the most important one. If you don't have that, then you should be instantly rejecting the chance of essentially taking investment from that investor. So the fact is that if an investor chooses to invest, and if you choose to take them on board, you're going to be working together. You're going to be in correspondence with that individual, that fund, over the next sort of 5+ years, potentially shorter time frame, but you should be thinking about it in those terms. And so, in the same way that you might not want to live with someone that you don't get along with, you should be viewing it through the same lens. You don't necessarily need to want to live with your investor, but you need to be able to put up with whoever that person is, whoever that fund is, after 5 years. And so, if you're aligned in terms of the sector that you're in, if you're aligned in terms of values and indeed objectives, then actually in 5 years' time, hopefully those parameters, those characteristics of what you're trying to achieve won't have changed too much, and ultimately you can still happily meet each other and work towards progressing the business, because ultimately, if your values are aligned, you're pulling in the same direction. And if you're pulling in the same direction, then ultimately your chances of success as a business and their chances of success as investors are that much higher. And so actually it's a really important balancing act for both parties, really, because your success is going to be theirs. They need to make sure that they're ultimately going to be helping you as much as they can.
I love the metaphor of thinking about someone you're living with, because it's easy to think of it as just a transaction when it's basically a relationship, or we should be thinking about it in a relationship lens.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that I think founders early on don't necessarily consider. And we definitely made that mistake in terms of some of the prospective investors that we spoke with. And it turned out that they were just not aligned at all with what we wanted to achieve, how they understood or thought about the industry, and the way that they thought that we should go about essentially trying to change it. And I'm glad that we essentially sidestepped those, but it really helped us to focus in on what types of investors do we want on our cap table. So we're lucky enough to have sort of eaten our own dog food on this particular question. So we actually have used our own search engine to identify an investor for our company. So we searched for someone who is interested in data science and venture capital, which is ultimately what we're building. And we found he's now the director of data science over a major US VC fund called Greycroft. So the person's name is Francesco Correa, and we actually found him via our own search engine, and we could see that his interests overlapped with ours. And that was the starting point of our conversation. We found a point of alignment, and having found that alignment, actually, we've benefited tremendously from the questions that Francesco has asked us. He thinks a lot about this space, so do we. He's got connections into the space that we've been able to leverage as a business, and ultimately, again, our success will be his success in that. And so the fact that those interests are aligned has already had a direct impact on our success and growth as a business. And obviously, it's absolutely fantastic for us to be able to say that, yeah, we've used our own solution to solve essentially a funding round question / problem that many founders are going to have. So I think that's one really good example. We've got another one which is around one of our investors is the previous chairman of the British Venture Capital Association, and again, a person who knows the industry, knows the problems, knows the people who are going to be interested in what we're doing and building. And these are the types of investors that, if they're on your side, they can really just turn up the volume for you. They can genuinely turbocharge the growth of your company, because instead of you needing to take 2 years to build a relationship with someone, actually they can massively reduce that time that it takes to build up that trust simply by offering their network and warm introductions to people who are also going to be interested in what you're doing. And you kind of get to skip ahead to the really good bit of working together if you've got investors that can do that for you. Yeah, so this is an evolving picture, and it's one that if you go back 15 years, there was no data out there basically at all. It was really, really difficult for founders to find investors, whether on the web or elsewhere, or even knowing where to go in person in order to find said investors. Like, people might have been able to identify banks or potentially some investment funds, but many investment funds were focused much later stage than sort of early stage startup venture capital space. So that changed. What happened was essentially more and more people started putting their contact information out there, or like putting websites out there, listing themselves in places like Crunchbase. And as that happened, more and more people identified that actually, there's still a scarcity problem with regards to information. I'm going to start producing investor lists, and I'm going to put these. Initially, these were like Excel files and like very structured databases, very old school. And even today, people are still putting investor lists on Airtables and sharing these. And in theory, that makes it easier. It certainly means that you've got contact information for investors. But what it doesn't do is, if you've got a list of 3,000 investors from somewhere online, it doesn't actually tell you which ones are the right ones. So yes, you can send a cold email that's sort of like a spray and pray type approach to all of those investors. But what you've probably done is you've probably blown your chance with, let's say, a couple of dozen of the investors on that list who are the right ones. And so their first interaction or engagement with you is they're going to read an email. It's not too difficult to discern that that email is a cold email, that you haven't put the time in to figure out why it was that they were relevant. And actually, so yeah, you've got a real conundrum as a founder. Your time is limited already. You know that you need funding. You know that you might need to have lots of conversations to get that funding, but it's a false economy to reach out to thousands of investors in a really generic way. Actually, your time is still better spent doing the research on who is the right person or who are the right people to have on that initial outreach list, and focusing on higher quality conversations that are well researched. Because actually, if you do your research, you're 7 times more likely to get a response from that individual, and for that response to be positive, because that individual will see that you've done your research. You can see why it is that they're relevant to your business, and they'll be able to see that too. And the fact that you've taken that time and that effort, they'll be far more likely to put that time and effort back into that conversation with you. So yeah, common challenge is that false economy, basically, between there's data, but actually what we really want to be providing founders with is information on the much smaller group of investors that they ought to be speaking. So it's always a really good idea to reach out to a portfolio company of theirs. So someone that they've invested in, ideally a company that they have been invested in for a longer period of time. The reason why it's really valuable is because they've got a much longer time period of engagement with that investor. And if you've got that longer time period, then ultimately there are more points in time that you can understand the way that investor behaves, because all businesses will go through ups and downs. And the longer the time period, the more ups and downs that business will have experienced, and the more ups and downs that business will have experienced with that investor. And so you can get a richer data set from speaking with those companies that they've already invested in about the way that investor behaves. And that's a really important factor to consider. Another really important one, I think, is to speak with other founders who've potentially gone partway through that investment process, but perhaps were not successful in raising investment. Because at this point in time, you still don't know whether you're going to be successful. And so you might want to know, actually, if I put energy and effort into this, how would a rejection or like a non-investment path or of interaction look here? Like, are they gonna potentially recommend me into others? If they are, then actually potentially you become more invested in making that process a good one, regardless of what the outcome is. And I think it's also really important just to be reaching out to other founders, because other founders might well be able to give you an indication on whether or not that firm's word can be trusted. We've been burnt by a couple of funds who've essentially gone right to the point, and actually beyond the point. They've signed documentation. They've stated that legally they're going to send funds within a couple of business days, and then they haven't done so. And one of the things that, thinking back now, I wish that I had done at the time was to ask more questions about the lack of evidence, because there wasn't evidence there that they had previously engaged with lots of other founders. I think there were 1 or 2 cases, and in those instances, like, the story didn't quite stack up, and I wish that I had dug deeper. But I think as a first-time founder and being quite naive, that was something that I didn't dig deep into, and ultimately we got burned, and it nearly cost the business. Let's say that we've really done our research. We know that investor is interested in what we're doing. So you can go into that room or into that conversation knowing what it is that they've done that makes them relevant to you. And if you can articulate how it is that you're relevant to your field, to your domain, what it is that you're building, then ultimately you've got a higher chance of achieving clarity with your messaging, because lots of founders think that they haven't got clear messaging. Sometimes, especially early days, it's because you're speaking with the wrong investor who doesn't understand your field. If a PhD scientist in the field of, I don't know, cancer detection were to take their research and their work in that space and speak with, Joe or Jane blogs on the street, the likelihood of that individual understanding what that scientist is saying is actually relatively low. And because founders usually know a lot about their own domain, they are initially very good at diving down into the weeds. And that means that there isn't clarity in that messaging. I think what actually happens with founders is, as time goes on, they become better at articulating complex concepts in a really simple way. And that helps them with achieving that simplicity, that clarity of message with investors that hopefully are domain experts, but aren't always going to be. There are many generalist investors out there, and they're really quite good, but you need to be able to speak with them as well. I think the confidence angle is something that can easily be misunderstood, and definitely we've been guilty of this too, where we perhaps thought that we knew more than we did, or at least we pretended to know more than we did. I think that's, again, a really common mistake for first-time founders in the first year or so of building, and they think that they ought to know all of the answers. But actually, what you should know, or the way that you should be thinking about things is especially if you've got like a science, or like if you've got a stats or analytics background, like school, university, then actually what you ought to be doing is trying to apply the scientific method as much as possible. Good investors aren't going to be looking for someone that knows all the answers. They're going to ask questions about areas that you can't possibly know yet. But what they're probably looking for really is founders that know how they would go and get the data that would inform them about how they're going to go and solve that problem. Because, we can't predict the future, and ultimately investors are wanting to invest in founders who are going to be nimble and with a relatively high degree of certainty, like the 80-20 rule, for example, are going to make the right decision 80% of the time, and they're going to get the most valuable, most important data points for a given situation very quickly, and come to what is probably the right answer really quickly too. So it's not necessarily confidence about what's going to happen like in all of the future. It's actually because we can't possibly know what's going to happen over the next 5 years, but it's you're backing the computer that's going to interpret the data in their field for those next 5 years and hopefully see that business and your investment to success.